Welcome back, fellow dissidents. We're gonna switch it up this time. We're gonna do. I'm gonna start doing a few live readings while discussing the philosophy. I understand that a lot of folks may know about the philosophy of libertarianism, and have a decent grasp on the philosophy, but I'm looking for something new, something informational, and something not so heavily related to current events, because that can get quite emotional and clickbaity. So I figured a good thing to do would be to introduce folks to the philosophy of libertarianism. And the first book that I picked is obviously going to be by Murray Rothbard. It's For a New Liberty. It's the Libertarian Manifesto. And I think it was the seminal work that brought me to the philosophy. And it's just he did the best at expounding on it. Murray Rothbard was a polymath. He was an economist. He was a historian. He was a philosopher. He was many, many different things. And in this day and age of hyper specialization, Murray Rothbard was just one of a kind. I mean, his economics was right on par with Ludwig von Mises. He even expounded on that further. And his revisionist history of economics and the progressive era and the revolutionary period, all great historical works. The man was just unparalleled when it comes to the division of labor and understanding the philosophy of libertarianism. So I figured I could we'll start with this book. It's obviously going to have to be chopped up into a few different sections. There's no way I can sit down and read the whole Libertarian Manifesto by Murray Rothbard in one sitting, but we'll see how it goes. I've got physical copies by all means. I'm not sure what the title will be, but thinking about starting like a digital dissident book club, something to that effect. And you can easily just listen, you can watch, you could read along, whatever. But I just figured that delving into the philosophy not only helps me brush up, which I've read For a New Liberty at least like four or five times in the past 8 years or something like that, but it will also help bring other folks into the know of what the actual libertarian creed is, where it comes from, how it works. I mean, everybody basically understands don't hurt people and take their shit. That we tell our kids this when they're very, very young, but there's a lot of application that goes into it and a lot of history as well. So I just figured it would be beneficial, and I'll be able to expound on it a little bit in current times, because this book was originally published in 1978. So that's something to keep in context while we're reading, because I'll be expounding on it as well. And it's amazing the parallels from then and now, as well as how well it still fits, right? So, all right. So we got For a New Liberty, the Libertarian Manifesto by Murray Newton Rothbard. All right. So introduction. There are many varieties of libertarianism alive in the world today, but Rothbardianism remains the center of its intellectual gravity, its primary muse and conscience, its strategic and moral core, and the focal point of debate, even when its name is not acknowledged. The reason is that Murray Rothbard was the creator of modern libertarianism, a political ideological system that proposes a once-and-for-all escape from the trappings of left and right and their central plans for how state power should be used. Libertarianism is the radical alternative that says state power is unworkable and immoral. Mr. Libertarian Murray N. Rothbard was called, and the state's greatest living enemy, quote unquote. He remains so. Yes, he had many predecessors from whom he drew, the whole of the classical liberal tradition, the Austrian economists, the American anti-war tradition, and the natural rights tradition. But it was he who put all these pieces together into a unified system that seems implausible at first, but inevitable once it has been defined and defended by Rothbard. The individual pieces of the system are straightforward: self-ownership, strict property rights, free markets, anti-state in every conceivable respect. but the implications are earth-shaking. Yeah, that's it. I originally came to this book trying to find the hole in libertarianism because I came up as a default liberal, the statist liberal, and I came to this philosophy saying there's no way that it's actually this consistent, and it is in fact earth-shaking. Once you are exposed to the complete picture, and For a New Liberty has been the leading means of exposure for more than a quarter of a century, you cannot forget it. It becomes the indispensable lens through which we can see events in the real world with the greatest possible clarity. This book, more than any other, explains why Rothbard seems to grow in stature every year. His influence has vastly risen since his death in 1995. I'll interject that. And why Rothbardianism has so many enemies on the left, right, and center. Quite simply, the science of liberty that he brought into clear relief is as thrilling in hope it creates for a free world as it is unforgiving of error. Its logical and moral consistency, together with its empirical explanatory muscle, represents a threat to any intellectual vision that sets out to use the state to refashion the world according to some pre-programmed plan. And to the same extent, it impresses the reader with a hopeful vision of what might be. Rothbard set out to write this book soon after he got a call from Tom Mandel, an editor at Macmillan, who had seen an op-ed by Rothbard in the New York Times that appeared in the spring of 1971. Damn well Rothbard wouldn't be printed today. It was the only commission Rothbard ever received from a commercial publishing house. Not surprising. Looking at the original manuscript, which is so consistent in its typeface and nearly complete after its first draft, it does seem that it was nearly effortless joy for him to write. It is seamless, unrelenting, and energetic. The historical context illustrates a point often overlooked. Modern libertarianism was born not in reaction to socialism or leftism, though it is certainly anti-leftist, as the term is commonly understood, and anti-socialist. Rather, libertarianism in the American historical context came into being in response to the statism of conservatism and its selective celebration of conservative-style central planning. Excuse me. American conservatives may not adore the welfare state or excessive business regulation, but they appreciate power exercised in the name of nationalism, warfarism, pro-family policies, quote-unquote, and invasion of personal liberty and privacy. In the post-LBJ era of American history, it has been Republican presidents more than Democratic ones who have been responsible for the largest expansions of executive and judicial power. It was to defend a pure liberty against the compromises and corruptions of conservatism, beginning with Nixon but continuing with Reagan and the Bush presidencies, that inspired the birth of Rothbardian political economy. And a lot of people aren't going to like hearing that. A lot of people aren't going to like hearing that it is in fact anti-leftist, but it's also it's against the neocons. It's against what you would call regular conservatism. If you weaponize the state, Rothbardianism is against that, plain and simple. And there's tribal tendencies on both sides, but we can if you are quote unquote a right winger, then it's easy to see the hypocrisy in the left. But it's even it's a little more difficult if you're involved in being a statist to look at the right in a critical fashion when you consider yourself a right winger. I mean, I have a socially conservative bent, I guess you could say, but the philosophy is just it's uncompromising. It's uncompromising, and you have to look at it in that fashion, in that context. It is also striking how Rothbard chose to pull no punches in his argument. That's why they don't like it. Other intellectuals on the receiving end of such an invitation might have tended to water down the argument to make it more palatable. Why, for example, make a case for statelessness or anarchism when a case for limited government might bring more people into the movement? Why condemn U.S. imperialism when doing so can only limit the book's appeal to anti-Soviet conservatives who might otherwise appreciate the free market bent? Why go into such depth about privatizing courts and roads and water when doing so might risk alienating people? Why enter into the sticky arena of regulation of consumption and of personal morality, and do it with such disorienting consistency when it would have surely drawn a larger audience to leave it out? And why go into such detail about monetary affairs and central banking and the like, when a watered-down case for free enterprise would have pleased so many Chamber of Commerce conservatives? But trimming and compromising for the sake of the Times or the audience was just not his way. He knew that he had a once-in-a-lifetime chance to present the full package of libertarianism in all its glory, and he was not about to pass it up. And thus do we read here, not just a case for cutting government, but eliminating it altogether, not just an argument for assigning property rights, but for deferring to the market even on questions of contract enforcement, and not just a case for cutting welfare, but for banishing the entire welfare warfare state. Both, not just welfare, but imperialism as well, as you'll see. Whereas other attempts to make a libertarian case both before and after this book might typically call for transitional or half measures, or be willing to concede as much as possible to statists, this is not what we get from Murray. Not for him such schemes as the school vouchers or the privatization of government programs that should not exist at all. Instead, he presents and follows through with the full-blown and fully bracing vision of what liberty can be. This is why so many other similar attempts to write the Libertarian Manifesto have not stood the test of time, and yet this book remains in high demand to this day. To this day, it's 2022, nearly 50 years later, and people are still enthralled by this man. Similarly, there have been many books on libertarianism in the intervening years that have covered philosophy alone, politics alone, economics alone, or history alone. Those that have put all these subjects together have usually been collections by various authors. Rothbard alone had mastery in all fields that permitted him to write an integrated manifesto, one that has never been displaced, and yet his approach is typically self-effacing. He constantly points to other writers and intellectuals of the past and his own generation. In addition, some introductions of this sort are written to give the reader an easier passage into a difficult book, but that is not the case here. He never talks down to his readers, but always with clarity. Rothbard speaks for himself. I'll spare the reader an enumeration of my favorite parts or speculations on what passages Rothbard might have clarified if he had a chance to put out a new edition. The reader will discover on his or her own that every page exudes energy and passion, that the logic of his argument is impossibly compelling, and that the intellectual fire that inspired this work burns as bright now as it did all those years ago. The book is still regarded as, quote, dangerous, unquote, precisely because once the exposure to Rothbardianism takes place, no other book on politics, economics, or sociology can be read the same way again. What was once a commercial phenomenon has truly become a classical statement that I predict will be read for generations to come. That is from the introduction of Llewellyn H. Rockwell Jr., and he is the founder of the Mises Institute. So a man of that stature, I mean, he was a Rothbardian, principled. All right, let's keep it cooking. Chapter 1, The Libertarian Heritage, the American Revolution, and Classical Liberalism. On Election Day 1976, you got to remember, keep it in context that this book came out in 1978, right? On Election Day 1976, the Libertarian Party presidential ticket of Roger L. MacBride for president and David P. Bergland for vice president amassed 174,000 votes in 32 states throughout the country. The sober Congressional Quarterly was moved to classify the fledgling Libertarian Party as the third major political party in America. The fact that it only began in 1971 with a handful of members gathered in a Colorado living room. The following year, it fielded a presidential ticket which managed to get on the ballot in 2 states, and now it is America's third major party. And, I might add, was recently taken over by principled Rothbardians. Imagine that. Even more remarkably, the Libertarian Party achieved this growth while consistently adhering to a new ideological creed, libertarianism, thus bringing to the American political scene for the first time in a century a party interested in principle rather than in merely gaining jobs and money through the public trough. We have been told countless times by pundits and political scientists that the genius of America and of our party system is its lack of ideology and its, quote, pragmatism, unquote, a kind word for focusing solely on grabbing money and jobs from the hapless taxpayers. How, then, explain the amazing growth of a new party which is frankly and eagerly devoted to ideology? One explanation is that Americans were not always pragmatic and non-ideological. On the contrary, historians now realize that the American Revolution itself was not only ideological but also the result of devotion to the creed and the institution of libertarianism. The American revolutionaries were steeped in the creed of libertarianism, an ideology which led them to resist with their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor the invasions of their rights and liberties committed by the imperial British government. Historians have long debated the precise causes of the American Revolution. Were they constitutional, economic, political, or ideological? We now realize that, being libertarians, the revolutionaries saw no conflict between moral and political rights on the one hand and economic freedom on the other. On the contrary, they perceived civil and moral liberty, political independence, and the freedom to trade and produce as all part of one unblemished system, what Adam Smith was to call, in the same year that the Declaration of Independence was written, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty, unquote. The libertarian creed emerged from the classical liberal movements of the 17th and 18th centuries in the Western world, specifically from the English Revolution of the 17th century. This radical libertarian movement, even though only partially successful in its birthplace, Great Britain, was still able to usher in the Industrial Revolution, thereby freeing industry and production from the strangling restrictions of state control and urban government-supported guilds. For the classical liberal movement was, throughout the Western world, a mighty libertarian revolution against what we might call the old order, the ancient regime, which had dominated its subjects for centuries. This regime had, in the early modern period beginning in the 16th century, imposed an absolute central state and king ruling by divine right on top of an older, restrictive web of feudal land monopolies and urban guild controls and restrictions. The result was a Europe stagnating under a crippling web of controls, taxes, and monopoly privileges to produce and sell conferred by central and local governments upon their favorite producers. This alliance of the new bureaucratic, war-making central state with privileged merchants, an alliance to be called mercantilism by later historians, and with a class of ruling feudal landlords constituted the old order against which the new movement of classical liberals and radicals arose and rebelled in the 17th and 18th centuries. The object of the classical liberals was to bring about individual liberty in all of its interrelated aspects. In the economy, taxes were to be drastically reduced, controls and regulations eliminated, and human energy, enterprise, and markets set free to create and produce in exchanges that would benefit everyone and the mass of consumers. Entrepreneurs were to be free at last to compete, to develop, to create. The shackles of control were to be lifted from land, labor, and capital alike. Personal freedom and civil liberty were to be guaranteed against the depredations of tyranny of the king or his minions. Religion, the source of bloody wars for centuries when sects were battling for control of the state, was to be set free from state imposition or interference so that all religions, or non-religions, could coexist in peace. Peace, too, was the foreign policy credo of the new classical liberals. The age-old regime of imperial and state aggrandizement for power and pelf was to be replaced by a foreign policy of peace and free trade with all nations. And since war was seen as engendered by standing armies and navies, by military power always seeking expansion, these military establishments were to be replaced by voluntary local militia, by citizen civilians who would only wish to fight in defense of their own particular homes and neighborhoods. Thus, the well-known theme of separation of church and state was but one of many interrelated motifs that could be summed up as separation of the economy from the state, separation of speech and press from the state, separation of land from the state, separation of war and military affairs from the state, indeed, the separation of the state from virtually anything. And separation of the economy from the state, in particular, we need a brand new revolution for this, because we do, in fact, in the Federal Reserve, in a fascist cooperation with our federal government, we do have a centrally planned economy. So we need to, you'll see, abolish the whole state, but, moving towards that, the best thing we could do is get rid of the Federal Reserve. Excuse me. The state, in short, was to be kept extremely small with a very low, nearly negligible budget. The classical liberals never developed a theory of taxation, but every increase in a tax and every new kind of tax was fought bitterly. In America, twice becoming the spark that led, or almost led, to the revolution, the stamp tax and the tea tax. The earliest theoreticians of libertarian classical liberalism were the levelers during the English Revolution and the philosopher John Locke in the late 17th century, followed by the true Whig, or radical libertarian opposition to the Whig settlement, the regime of 18th century Britain. John Locke set forth the natural rights of each individual to his person and property. The purpose of government was strictly limited to defending such rights. In the words of the Lockean-inspired Declaration of Independence, to secure these rights, quote, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, end quote, or to abolish it. Wow, I hate this this idea that the libertarian credo is too radical. It's in our Constitution that should our government become too tyrannical, that it is our right and our duty to abolish it. It's in the damn framework of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. While Locke was widely read in American colonies, his abstract philosophy was scarcely calculated to rouse men to revolution. This task was accomplished by radical Lockeans in the 18th century, who wrote in a more popular, hard-hitting, and impassioned manner and applied the basic philosophy to the concrete problems of the government, and especially the British government of the day. The most important in this vein was Cato's Letters, a series of newspaper articles published in the early 1720s in London by true Whigs John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon. While Locke had written of the revolutionary pressure which could properly be exerted when government became destructive of liberty, Trenchard and Gordon pointed out that the government always tended toward such destruction of individual rights. According to Cato's Letters, human history is a record of irrepressible conflict between power and liberty, with power, government, always standing ready to increase its scope by invading people's rights and encroaching on liberties. Therefore, Cato declared, power must be kept small and faced with eternal vigilance and hostility on the part of the public to make sure that it always stays within narrow bounds. He goes on. We know by infinite examples and experience that men possessed of power, rather than part with it, will do anything, even the worst and the blackest, to keep it, and scarce ever any man upon earth went out of it as long as he could carry everything his own way in it. This seems certain, that the good of the world or of their people was not one of their motives either for continuing in power or for quitting it. It is the nature of power to be ever encroaching and converting every extraordinary power granted at particular times and upon particular occasions into an ordinary power to be used at all times, and when there is no occasion, nor does it ever part willingly with any advantage. Alas, power encroaches daily upon liberty with a success too evident, and the balance between them is almost lost. Tyranny has engrossed almost the whole earth, and striking at mankind root and branch makes the world a slaughterhouse, and will certainly go on to destroy till it is either destroyed itself, or, which is most likely, has nothing else left to destroy. Such warnings were eagerly imbibed by the American colonists, who reprinted Cato's letters many times throughout the colonies and down to the time of the Revolution. Such a deep-seated attitude led to what the historian Bernard Bailyn has aptly called the transforming radical libertarianism of the American Revolution. For the Revolution was not only the first successful modern attempt to throw off the yoke of Western imperialism at that time of the world's mightiest power. More important, for the first time in history, Americans hedged in their new governments with numerous limits and restrictions embodied in constitutions and particularly in bills of rights. Church and state were rigorously separated throughout the new states, and religious freedom enshrined. Remnants of feudalism were eliminated throughout the states by the abolition of the feudal privileges of entail and primogeniture. In the former, a dead ancestor is able to entail landed estates in his family forever, preventing his heirs from selling any part of the land. In the latter, the government requires the sole inheritance of property by the oldest son. The new federal government, formed by the Articles of Confederation, was not permitted to levy any taxes upon the public, and any fundamental extension of its powers required unanimous consent by every state government. Above all, the military and war-making power of the national government was hedged in by restraint and suspicion. For the 18th century libertarians understood that war, standing armies, and militarism had long been the main method for aggrandizing state power. Bernard Bailyn has summed up the achievement of the American revolutionaries. The modernization of American politics and government during and after the Revolution took the form of a sudden, radical realization of the program that had first been fully set forth by the opposition intelligentsia in the reign of George I, where the English position, forcing its way against complacent social and political order, had only striven and dreamed. Americans, driven by the same aspirations, but living in a society in many ways modern, and now released politically, could suddenly act. Where the English opposition had vainly agitated for partial reforms, American leaders moved swiftly and with little social disruption to implement systematically the outermost possibilities of the whole range of radically liberation ideas. In the process, they infused into American political culture the major themes of the 18th century radical libertarianism brought to realization here. The first is the belief that power is evil, a necessity perhaps, but an evil necessity, that it is infinitely corrupting, and that it must be controlled, limited, restricted in every way compatible with a minimum of civil order. Written constitutions, the separation of powers, bills of rights, limitations on executives, on legislators and courts, restrictions on the right to coerce and wage war, all express the profound distrust of power that lies at the ideological heart of the American Revolution, and that has remained with us as a permanent legacy ever after. Thus, while classical liberal thought began in England, it was to reach its most consistent and radical development and its greatest living embodiment in America. For the American colonies were free of the feudal land monopoly and aristocratic ruling caste that was entrenched in Europe. In America, the rulers were British colonial officials and a handful of privileged merchants who were relatively easy to sweep aside when the Revolution came and the British government was overthrown. Classical liberalism, therefore, had more popular support and met far less entrenched institutional resistance in the American colonies than it found at home. Furthermore, being geographically isolated, the American rebels did not have to worry about the invading armies of neighboring counter-revolutionary governments, as, for example, was the case in France. So essentially, the revolution was a radically libertarian movement that, by all historical, economic, and political contexts, was a perfect storm to breed libertarianism. And if you the example of power being elitist and immoral, I suggest you look into James Burnham's The Machiavellians. That's a great power politics outlook. And if you want to see just how radically libertarian the Revolutionary era was, I suggest you look into Murray Rothbard's He's got a 5-volume book set of the Revolutionary period, and it's absolutely fantastic. There was actually a period of a good period of time where Pennsylvania was quasi anarchistic. There was essentially no government, and when they showed up, there was dust all over the municipal government buildings because nobody was ever there doing anything. People were engaged in their own markets and their own lives. So that's how it should be. Anyways, continuing on, after the Revolution, thus America above all countries was born in an explicitly libertarian revolution, a revolution against empire, against taxation, trade monopoly, and regulation, and against militarism and executive power. The revolution resulted in governments unprecedented in restrictions placed on their power. But while there was very little institutional resistance in America to the onrush of liberalism, there did appear from the very beginning powerful elite forces, especially among the large merchants and planters, who wished to retain the restrictive British quote-unquote mercantilist system of high taxes, controls, and monopoly privileges conferred by the government. And you'll see as we go on, the only kind of monopolies that are even close to sustainable or feasible are ones that are upheld by the state. These groups wished for a strong central and even imperial government. In short, they wanted the British system without Great Britain. These conservative and reactionary forces first appeared during the Revolution and later formed the Federalist Party and the Federalist Administration of the 1790s. During the 19th century, however, the libertarian impetus continued. The Jeffersonian and Jacksonian movements, the Democratic, Republican, and then the Democratic parties, explicitly strived for the virtual elimination of government from American life. It was to be a government without a standing army or navy, a government without debt, and with no direct federal or excise taxes and virtually no import tariffs, that is, with negligible levels of taxation and expenditure. A government that does not engage in public works or internal improvements, a government that does not control or regulate, a government that leaves money and banking free, hard, and uninflated. In short, in the words of H.L. Mencken's ideal, a government that barely escapes being no government at all, quote unquote. The Jeffersonian drive toward virtually no government foundered after Jefferson took office. First, with concessions to the Federalists, possibly the result of a deal for Federalist votes to break a tie in the Electoral College, and then with the unconstitutional purchase of the Louisiana Territory. But most particularly, it foundered with the imperialist drive towards war with Britain in Jefferson's second term, a drive which led to war and to a one-party system which established virtually the entire statist Federalist program: high military expenditures, a central bank, a protective tariff, direct federal taxes, and public works. Horrified at the results, a retired Jefferson brooded at Monticello and inspired young visiting politicians Martin Van Buren and Thomas Hart Benton to found a new party, the Democratic Party, to take back America from the new federalism and to recapture the spirit of the old Jeffersonian program. When the two young leaders latched on to Andrew Jackson as their savior, the new Democratic Party was born. The Jacksonian Libertarians had a plan. It was to be 8 years of Andrew Jackson as president, to be followed by 8 years of Van Buren, then 8 years of Benton. After 24 years of a triumphant Jacksonian democracy, the Menckian virtually no government ideal was to have been achieved. It was by no means an impossible dream, since it was clear that the Democratic Party had quickly become the normal majority party in the country. The mass of the people were enlisted in the libertarian cause. Jackson had his 8 years, which destroyed the central bank and retired the public debt, and Van Buren had 4, which separated the federal government from the banking system. But the 1840 election was an anomaly, as Van Buren was defeated by an unprecedentedly demagogic campaign engineered by the first modern campaign chairman, Thurlow Weed, who pioneered in all the campaign frills, catchy slogans, buttons, songs, parades, etc., with which we are now familiar. Yeah, and the demagoguery has only gotten worse, as we see. Weed's tactics put in office the egregious and unknown Whig General William Henry Harrison, but this was clearly a fluke. In 1844, the Democrats would be prepared to counter with the same campaign tactics, and they were clearly slated to recapture the presidency that year. Van Buren, of course, was supposed to resume the triumphal Jacksonian march. But then a fateful event occurred. The Democratic Party was sundered on the critical issue of slavery, or rather the expansion of slavery into a new territory. Van Buren's easy renomination foundered on a split within the ranks of the Democracy over the admission of the Union of the Republic of Texas as a slave state. Van Buren was opposed, Jackson was in favor, and this split symbolized the wider sectional rift within the Democratic Party. Slavery, the grave anti-libertarian flaw in the libertarianism of the Democratic program, had arisen to wreck the party and its libertarianism completely. The Civil War, in addition to its unprecedented bloodshed and devastation, was used by the triumphal and virtually one-party Republican regime to drive through its status formerly Whig program: national government power, protective tariffs, subsidies to big business, inflationary paper money, resume control of the federal government over banking, large-scale internal improvements, high excise taxes, and during the war, conscription and income tax. Furthermore, the states came to lose their previous right of secession and other states' powers as opposed to the federal government powers. The Democratic Party resumed its libertarian ways after the war, but it now had to face a far longer and more difficult road to arrive at liberty than it had before. We have seen how America came to have the deepest libertarian tradition, a tradition that still remains in much of our political rhetoric and is still reflected in a feisty and individualistic attitude toward government by much of the American people. There is far more fertile soil in this country than in any other for a resurgence of libertarianism. Resistance to liberty. We can now see that the rapid growth of the libertarian movement and the Libertarian Party in the 1970s is firmly rooted in what Bernard Bailey called this powerful permanent legacy of the American Revolution. But if this legacy is so vital to the American tradition, what went wrong? Why the need for a new libertarian movement to arise to reclaim the American dream? To begin to answer this question, we must first remember that classical liberalism constituted a profound threat to the political and economic interests of the ruling classes, who benefited from the old order: the kings, the nobles, and the landed aristocrats, the privileged merchants, the military machines, the state bureaucracies. Despite three major violent revolutions precipitated by the liberals, the English of the 17th century and the American and French of the 18th, victories in Europe were only partial. Resistance was stiff and managed to successfully maintain landed monopolies, religious establishments, and warlike foreign and military policies, and for a time to keep the suffrage restricted to the wealthy elite. The liberals had to concentrate on widening the suffrage because it was clear to both sides that the objective economic and political interests of the mass of the public lay in individual liberty. It is interesting to note that by the early 19th century, the laissez-faire forces were known as liberals and radicals, for the purer, more consistent among them, and the opposition that wished to preserve or go back to the old order were broadly known as conservatives. Excuse me. Indeed, conservatism began in the early 19th century as a conspicuous attempt to undo and destroy the hated work of the new classical liberal spirit of the American, French, and Industrial Revolutions, led by two reactionary French thinkers, de Bonald and de Maistre. Conservatism yearned to replace equal rights and equality before the law by the structured and hierarchical rule of privileged elites, individual liberty and minimal government by absolute rule and big government, religious freedom by the theocratic rule of state church, peace and free trade by militarism, mercantilist restrictions, and war for advantage of the nation state, and industry and manufacturing by the old feudal and agrarian order. And they wanted to replace the new world of mass consumption and rising standards of living for all by the order of bare subsistence for the masses and luxury for the consumption of the ruling elite. This has been the status quo for thousands of years. It's not new for the World Economic Forum and the Davos folks to want us to live in bare subsistence and produce for them as slaves. It is indefinitely a serious issue to have at the forefront of your mind and to advocate against, but it should by no means be thought of as a new historical context to be looked at. It is in fact the status quo. And most times when people argue against libertarian anarchism, they're worried about warring warlords and such. It's like, what do we have now? 9 times out of 10, they're arguing against the status quo, not libertarian anarchism. On we go. By the middle of, and certainly by the end of the 19th century, conservatives began to realize that their cause was inevitably doomed if they persisted in clinging to the call for outright repeal of the Industrial Revolution and of its enormous rise in the living standards of the massive public, and also if they persisted in opposing the widening of the suffrage, thereby frankly setting themselves in opposition to the interests of that public. Hence the, quote, right wing, unquote, a label based on an accident of geography by which the spokesman for the old order sat on the right of the assembly hall during the French Revolution. I'm going to stop right there. And this is what people get wrong when I say that libertarianism, qua-libertarianism, has to be right-wing. Everybody says, oh, well, even Rothbard said that libertarians are to the left of liberals. And what he means is, in a historical context, the liberals, the laissez-faire, unregulated, no welfare, warfare liberals, sat to the left in the French Revolution. It was a happenstance of geography. The conservatives, the people of the monarchical king, mercantilist, the status quo of that contemporary time sat to the right, which made them right-wing, and the laissez-faire liberals sat to the left. And of course, even those liberals weren't as radical as abolishing the state. Therefore, what he means is libertarian anarchists, in fact, are to the left of classical liberals. He wasn't arguing that there's some left libertarian thing that is, it fits into the woke worldview. We couldn't care less. I'm not going to speak for Rothbard on culture, as you can do that for yourself, but left libertarianism is not a thing in the way that is described by Rothbard. When he says we're to the left, or even, he's talking about the historical context, and people twist that up to say, oh, you must be wrong. That left libertarianism must be a thing. And in fact, it can't be, because it's not based in private property rights. They absolutely abhor private property rights. Just have to get that straight, because I've heard that a million times. Oh, well, if it can't be left-wing, then why did Rothbard argue that we were to the left of liberals? Because he's talking about the historical context, and we are, in fact, more radical. And way to the left if you consider it in a historical context. Moving on. Decided to shift their gears and to update their status creed by jettisoning outright opposition to industrialism and democratic suffrage. For the old conservatism's frank hatred and contempt for the mass of the public, the new conservatives substituted duplicity and demagogy. The new conservatives wooed the masses with the following line: we too favor industrialism and a higher standard of living. But to accomplish such ends, we must regulate industry for the public good. We must substitute organized cooperation for the dog-eat-dog of the free and competitive marketplace. And above all, we must substitute for the nation-destroying liberal tenets of peace and free trade the nation-glorifying measures of war, protectionism, empire, and military prowess. And thus the conservative was born. For all of these changes, of course, big government rather than minimal government was required, and it stays to that day. You hear the rhetoric of quote-unquote right-wingers and, the MAGA Republicans that are just so radical according to the Democrats. They still want big government. When Donald Trump came in, he expanded on Obama's budget. What kind of small government conservative are you? It's been the same rhetoric since back in these times, as we see. And so, in the late 19th century, statism and big government returned, but this time displaying a pro-industrial and pro-general welfare face. The old order returned, but this time the beneficiaries were shuffled a bit. They were not so much the nobility, the feudal landlords, the army, the bureaucracy, and privileged merchants as they were the army, the bureaucracy, the weakened feudal landlords, and especially the privileged manufacturers, led by Bismarck and Prussia, and that's important for the school part. The new right fashioned a right-wing collectivism based on war, militarism, protectionism, and the compulsory cartelization of business and industry, a giant network of controls, regulations, subsidies, and privileges which forged a great partnership of big government with certain favored elements in big business and industry. And if you read into the historical context of all that and Bismarck and Prussia, that is where you get the collectivist, right-wing, National Socialist Party. Okay? Something had to be done, too, about the new phenomenon of a massive number of industrial wage workers, the, quote, proletariat, unquote, during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Indeed, until the late 19th century, the mass of workers favored laissez-faire and the free competitive market as best for their wages and working conditions as workers, and for cheap and widening range of consumer goods as consumers. Even the early trade unions, example given, Great Britain, were staunch believers in laissez-faire. New conservatives, spearheaded by Bismarck in Germany and Disraeli in Britain, weakened the libertarian will of the workers by shedding crocodile tears about the condition of the industrial labor force and cartelizing and regulating industry, not accidentally hobbling efficient competition. Finally, in the early 20th century, the new conservative corporate state, quote-unquote, then and now the dominant political system in the Western world, it's been fascist, this isn't new, incorporated, quote, responsible, unquote, and corporatist trade unions as junior partners to big government and favored big businesses in the new statist and corporatist decision-making system. Even since back then, we don't have laissez-faire capitalist free markets. We have a corporatist, big government, fascist cooperated nation state. And it's not true just because Rothbard said it. Look into the history. Fascism is the only kind of socialism that can last long term. It will inevitably fail. It's not sustainable, but it allows for prices. That's why they evolved this Leviathan fascism, is because it has the price. It's distorted prices, but at least it's not socialism where you have no prices and are forced to go to the black market. To establish this new system, to create a new order which was modernized, dressed-up version of the ancient regime. Before the American and French revolutions, the new ruling elites had to perform a gigantic con job on the deluded public, a con job that continues to this day, whereas the existence of every government, from absolute monarchy to military dictatorship, rests on the consent of the majority of the public. A democratic government must engineer such consent on a more immediate day-by-day basis. All tyrants rest on public consent. And to do so, the new conservative ruling elites had to gull the public in many crucial and fundamental ways, for the masses now had to be convinced that tyranny was better than liberty, that a cartelized and privileged industrial feudalism was better for the consumers than freely competitive markets, that a cartelized monopoly was to be imposed in the name of anti-monopoly, and that war and military aggrandizement for the benefit of the ruling elites was really in the interest of the conscripted, taxed, and often slaughtered public. How was this to be done? In all societies, public opinion is determined by the intellectual classes, the opinion molders of society. For most people neither originate nor disseminate ideas and concepts. On the contrary, they tend to adopt those ideas promulgated by the professional intellectual classes, the professional dealers in ideas. Now, throughout history, as we shall see further below, despots and ruling elites of states have had far more need of the services of intellectuals than have peaceful citizens in a free society. For states have always needed opinion-molding intellectuals to con the public into believing that its rule is wise, good, and inevitable, into believing that the emperor has clothes, quote unquote, which in fact it doesn't. Continuing on. Until the modern world, such intellectuals were inevitably churchmen or witch doctors, the guardians of religion. It was a cozy alliance, this age-old partnership between church and state. The church informed its deluded charges that the king ruled by divine command and therefore must be obeyed. In return, the king funneled numerous tax revenues into the coffers of the church. Hence, the great importance for the libertarian classical liberals of their success at separating church and state. The new liberal world was a world in which intellectuals could be secular, could make a living on their own in the market apart from state subvention. To establish their new statist order, their neo-mercantilist corporate state, the new conservatives therefore had to forge a new alliance between intellectual and state. In an increasingly secular age, this meant with secular intellectuals rather than with divines, specifically with the new breed of professors, PhDs, historians, teachers, and technocratic economists, social workers, sociologists, physicians, and engineers, the experts. This reforged alliance came in two parts. In the early 19th century, the conservatives, conceding reason to their liberal enemies, relied heavily on the alleged virtues of irrationality, romanticism, tradition, and theocracy. By stressing the virtue of tradition and irrational symbols, the conservatives could gull the public into continuing privileged, hierarchical rule and to continue to worship the nation-state and its war-making machine. Hasn't changed. Continuing on. In the latter part of the 19th century, the new conservatism adopted the trappings of reason and of quote-unquote science. Imagine how these things have, how they've bloomed into our time. Excuse me. Now it was science that allegedly required rule of the economy and of society by technocratic experts, quote-unquote. In exchange for spreading this message to the public, the new breed of intellectuals was rewarded with jobs and prestige as apologists for the new order and as planners and regulators of the new cartelized economy and society. To ensure dominance of the new strain of statism over public opinion, to ensure that the public's consent would be engineered, the governments of the Western world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries moved to seize control over education, over the minds of men, over the universities, and over the general education through compulsory school attendance laws and a network of public schools. The public schools were consciously used to inculcate obedience to the state as well as other civic virtues among their young charges. Furthermore, this statizing of education ensured that one of the biggest vested interests in expanding statism would be the nation's teachers and professional educationists, and it's still that way to this day. The status quo of the Prussian model is here. One of the ways that the new statist intellectuals did their work was to charge the meaning of old labels and therefore to manipulate the minds of the public in the emotional connotations attached to such labels. For example, the laissez-faire libertarians had long been known as, quote, liberals, unquote, and the purest and most militant of them as, quote, unquote, radicals. They had also been known as progressives, quote, unquote, because they were the ones in tune with industrial progress, the spread of liberty, and the rise of living standards of consumers. The new breed of statists, academics, and intellectuals appropriated to themselves the words liberal and progressive and successfully managed to tar their laissez-faire opponents with the charge of being old-fashioned, Neanderthal, and reactionary, and thus you get the switch. Even the name conservative was pinned on the classical liberals, and as we have seen, the new statists were able to appropriate the concept of reason as well. If the laissez-faire liberals were confused by the new recrudescence of statism and mercantilism as progressive corporate statism, Another reason for the decay of classical liberalism by the end of the 19th century was the growth of a peculiar new movement, socialism. Excuse me. Socialism began in the 1830s and expanded greatly after the 1880s. The peculiar thing about socialism was that it was a confused hybrid movement influenced by both the two great pre-existing polar ideologies, liberalism and conservatism. From the classical liberals, the socialists took a frank acceptance of industrialism and the Industrial Revolution, an early glorification of science and reason, and at least a rhetorical devotion to such classical liberal ideas as peace, individual freedom, and a rising standard of living. Indeed, the socialists, long before the much later corporatists, pioneered in co-opting of science, reason, and industrialism. And the socialists not only adopted the classical liberal adherence to democracy, but topped it by calling for an expanded democracy in which the people would run the economy and each other. On the other hand, from the conservatives, the socialists took a devotion to coercion and the status means for trying to achieve these liberal goals. Industrial harmony and growth were to be achieved by aggrandizing the state into an all-powerful institution ruling the economy and the society in the name of science, quote-unquote. A vanguard of technocrats was to assume all-powerful rule over everyone's person and property in the name of the quote-unquote people and quote-unquote democracy. Not content with the liberal achievement of reason and freedom for scientific research, the socialist state would install rule by the scientists of everyone else. Not content with liberals setting the workers free to achieve undreamt of prosperity, the socialist state would install rule by the workers of everyone else, or rather rule by politicians, bureaucrats, and technocrats in their name. If you read Ludwig von Mises's Socialism, it inevitably devolves into that. They can tell you otherwise, but it is the case. Not content with the liberal creed of equality of rights, of equality before the law, the socialist state would trample on such equality on behalf of the monstrous and impossible goal of equality or uniformity of results, or rather would erect a new privileged elite, a new class, in the name of bringing about such an impossible equality. You got to chop off the top and put it under the bottom, supposedly, is how it's done. Excuse me. You'll have to forgive me. Socialism was a confused and hybrid moment because it tried to achieve the liberal goals of freedom, peace, and industrial harmony and growth, goals which can only be achieved through liberty and the separation of government from virtually everything by imposing the old conservative means of statism, collectivism, and hierarchical privilege. It was a movement which could only fail, which indeed did fail miserably in those numerous countries where it attained power in the 20th century by bringing the masses only unprecedented despotism, starvation, and grinding impoverishment. You know, it makes you wonder why historically everybody wants to call somebody a Nazi and how bad Hitler is. And granted, he was in fact a unique evil in the world, which is why every new reason for war isn't a new Hitler. He was unique. But why is it that the schools don't teach us so much about the Holodomor and Stalin? Ponder on that for a minute. But the worst thing about the rise of the socialist movement was that it was able to outflank the classical liberals on the left, quote unquote, that is, as the party of hope, of radicalism, of revolution in the Western world. For just as the defenders of the ancient regime took their place on the right side of the hall during the French Revolution, so the liberals and radicals sat on the left. From then on until the rise of socialism, the libertarian classical liberals were the left, quote unquote, even the extreme left, quote unquote, on the ideological spectrum. That's where they get it from. The radical left was the laissez-faire liberals. That doesn't mean that radically socialist, communistic ideas are what the socialist libertarians are. No, there is no brand of left-wing libertarianism. As he argues, it's left in historical context because they sat on the left. not because they were all some type of libertarian socialists or something. There's no such thing. Private property anarchism, laissez-faire liberalism is what he's talking about. A radical version. I apologize, that just gets me bent. As late as 1848, such militant laissez-faire French liberals as Friedrich Bastiat sat on the left in the National Assembly. The classical liberals had begun as the Radical Revolutionary Party in the West, as the party of hope and of change on behalf of liberty, peace, and progress, to allow themselves to be outflanked, to allow the socialists to pose as the party of the left, quote-unquote, was a bad strategic error, allowing the liberals to be put falsely into a confused middle-of-the-road position with socialism and conservatism as the polar opposites. Thus, libertarianism became centrist. Since libertarianism is nothing if not a party of change and of progress towards liberty, abandonment of that role meant the abandonment of much of their reason for existence, in either reality or in the minds of the public. But none of this could have happened if the classical liberals had not allowed themselves to decay from within. They could have pointed out, as some of them indeed did, that socialism was confused, self-contradictory, quasi-conservative movement, absolute monarchy, and feudalism with a modern face, and that they themselves were still the only true radicals, undaunted people who insisted on nothing less than complete victory for the libertarian ideal. All right, and that's that puts us about an hour in. We'll go ahead and let's see here. You have to forgive me. This was a fairly spur of the moment. Let's just see here. Yeah, we'll just go ahead and finish this section. We'll probably need quite a few times, and we'll probably skip around a bit, but I believe this to be very, very important. Decay from within. But after achieving impressive partial victories against statism, the classical liberals began to lose their radicalism, their dogged insistence on carrying the battle against conservative statism to the point of final victory. Instead of using partial victories as a stepping stone for ever more pressure, the classical liberals began to lose their fervor for change and for purity of principle. They began to rest content with trying to safeguard their existing victories and thus turn themselves from a radical into a conservative movement, quote-unquote conservative in the sense of being content to preserve the status quo, which is the same to today. Imagine that paradox, that it still exists today that way. In short, the liberals left the field wide open for socialism to become the party of hope and radicalism, and even for the later corporatists to pose as, quote, liberals and progressives, unquote, as against the extreme right-wing and conservatives, quote, unquote, libertarian classical liberals, since the latter allowed themselves to be boxed into a position of hoping for nothing more than stasis, than absence of change. Such a strategy is foolish and untenable in a changing world. The degeneration of liberalism was not merely one of stance and strategy, but one of principle as well. For the liberals became content to leave the war-making power in the hands of the state, to leave the education power in its hands, to leave the power of money and banking, roads, in the hands of the state. In short, to concede state dominion over all crucial levels of power in society. In contrast to the 18th century liberals' total hostility to the executive and bureaucracy, the 19th century liberals tolerated and even welcomed the buildup of executive power and entrenched oligarchic civil service bureaucracy. Excuse me. Moreover, principle and strategy merged in the decay of 18th century and early 19th century liberal devotion to abolitionism, to the view that whether the institution be slavery or any other aspect of statism, it should be abolished as quickly as possible, since the immediate abolition of statism, while unlikely in practice, was to be sought after as the only possible moral position. For to prefer a gradual whittling away to immediate abolition of an evil and coercive institution is to ratify and sanction such evil, and therefore violate libertarian principles. As the great abolitionist of slavery and libertarian William Lloyd Garrison explained, urge immediate abolition as earnestly as we may, it will, alas, be gradual abolition in the end. We have never said that slavery would be overthrown by a single blow, that it ought to be, we shall always contend. And now today with the state, it will probably be gradual, but we're always looking for the red button that abolishes it immediately. There were two critically important changes in the philosophy and ideology of classical liberalism, which both exemplified and contributed to its decay as a vital, progressive, and radical force in the Western world. The first and most important, occurring in the early to mid-19th century, was the abandonment of the philosophy of natural rights and its replacement by technocratic utilitarianism. Instead of liberty grounded on the imperative morality of each individual's right to person and property, that is, instead of liberty being sought primarily on the basis of right and justice, utilitarianism preferred liberty as generally the best way to achieve a vaguely defined general welfare or common good. There were two grave consequences of this shift from natural rights to utilitarianism. First, the purity of the goal, the consistency of the principle was inevitably shattered. For whereas natural rights libertarian seeking morality and justice cleaves militantly to pure principle, the utilitarian only values liberty as an ad hoc expedient. And since expediency can and does shift with the wind, it will become easy for the utilitarian in his cool calculus of cost and benefit to plump for statism in ad hoc case after case, and thus giving principle away. Indeed, this is precisely what happened to the Benthamite utilitarians in England. Beginning with ad hoc libertarianism and laissez-faire, they found it ever easier to slide further and further into statism. An example was the drive for an efficient and therefore strong civil service and executive power. An efficiency that took precedence, indeed replaced any concept of justice or right. Second, and equally important, it is rare indeed ever to find a utilitarian who is also radical, who burns for immediate abolition of evil and coercion. This is the if you've seen the Tim Cast episode with Dave Smith just recently. It's October, so it would have been sometime around October 2022, depending when you're watching this. But that is the difference. Tim claims himself to be a liberal, and he said, in fact, on the show that Dave is a radical and Tim is a reformer. And that is what is being described here. It's still the status quo. It's still that if you're not radical, you're just ratifying the state. Utilitarians, continuing on, with their devotion to expediency, almost inevitably oppose any sort of upsetting or radical change. Sound like somebody you know? There have been no utilitarian revolutionaries. Hence, utilitarians are never immediate abolitionists. The abolitionist is such because he wishes to eliminate wrong and injustice as rapidly as possible. In choosing this goal, there is no room for cool, ad hoc weighing of cost and benefit. Hence, the classical liberal utilitarians abandoned radicalism and became mere gradualist reformers, and they're still that way today. But in becoming reformers, they also put themselves inevitably into the position of advisors and efficiency experts to the state, still today. In other words, they inevitably came to abandon libertarian principle as well as a principled libertarian strategy. The utilitarians wound up as apologists for the existing order, for the status quo, and hence were all too open to the charge by socialist and progressive corporatists that they were mere narrow-minded and conservative opponents of any and all change. Thus, starting as radicals and revolutionaries, as the polar opposites of conservatives, the classical liberals wound up as the image of the thing that they had fought. This utilitarian crippling of libertarianism is still with us, as I just noted, by a specific and common large evidenced in the Timcast. Thus, in the early days of economic thought, utilitarianism captured free market economics with the influence of Bentham and Ricardo, and this influence is today fully as strong as ever. Current free market economics is all too rife with appeals to gradualism, with scorn for ethics, justice, and consistent principle, and with a willingness to abandon free market principles at the drop of a cost-benefit hat. Hence, current free market economics is generally envisioned by intellectuals as merely apologetics for a slightly modified status quo, and all too often such charges are correct. And this was in 78. It's still the case in 2022. A second reinforcing change in the ideology of classical liberals came during the late 19th century when, at least for a few decades, they adopted the doctrines of social evolutionism, often called social Darwinism. Generally, statist historians have smeared social Darwinist laissez-faire liberals as Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner as cruel champions of the extermination, or at least of the disappearance, of the socially unfit. Much of this was simply the dressing up of sound economic and sociological free market doctrine in the then fashionable trappings of evolutionism. And you get that all the time. People think that when they read historical context that they can't seem to put it in a contemporary context, whereas, like he's saying, Herbert Spencer was taken as from a view of today. Back then, social Darwinism hadn't been eradicated as an idea, so therefore the argument against it wasn't strong enough to abandon it. It was using free market principles in a socialist in a social way, which didn't work eventually, but they didn't know that at the time. So you have to keep that in perfect context. People often look back at history with today's contemporary eye and forget that the entire worldview of anybody could never possibly view it from a modern day worldview. Continuing on. But the really important and crippling aspect of their social Darwinism was the illegitimate carrying over to the social sphere of the view that species, or later genes, change very, very slowly after millennia of time. The social Darwinist liberal came then to abandon the very idea of revolution or radical change in favor of sitting back and waiting for the inevitable tiny evolutionary changes over eons of time. In short, ignoring the fact that liberalism had to break through the power of the ruling elites by a series of radical changes and revolutions, the social Darwinists became conservatives, preaching against any radical measures and in favor only of the most minutely gradual of changes. In fact, the great libertarian Spencer himself is a fascinating illustration of just such a change in classical liberalism, and his case is paralleled in America by William Graham Sumner. In a sense, Herbert Spencer embodies within himself much of the decline of liberalism in the 19th century, for Spencer began as a magnificently radical liberal, as virtually a pure libertarian, but as the virus of sociology and social Darwinism took over in his soul, Spencer abandoned libertarianism as a dynamic radical historical movement, although without abandoning it in pure theory. While looking forward to an eventual victory of pure liberty, of contract as against status, of industry as against militarism, Spencer began to see that victory as inevitable, but only after a millennia of gradual evolution. Hence, Spencer abandoned liberalism as a fighting radical creed and confined his liberalism in practice to a weary, conservative, rearguard action against the growing collectivism and statism of his day. But if utilitarianism, bolstered by social Darwinism, was the main agent of philosophical and ideological decay in the liberal movement, the single most important and even cataclysmic reason for its demise was its abandonment of formally stringent principles against war, empire, and militarism. In country after country, it was the siren song of nation-state and empire that destroyed classical liberalism. In England, the liberals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries abandoned the anti-war, anti-imperialist Little Englandism of Cobden, Bright, and the Manchester School. Instead, they adopted the obscenely entitled liberal imperialism, joining the conservatives in the expansion of empire and the conservatives and the right-wing socialists in the destructive imperialism and collectivism of World War I. in Germany, Bismarck was able to split the previously almost triumphant liberals by setting up the lure of unification of Germany by blood and iron. In both countries, the result was the destruction of the liberal cause. In the United States, the classical liberal party had long been the Democratic Party, known in the later 19th century as the Party of Personal Liberty, quote unquote. Basically, it had been the party not only of personal but also economic liberty, the stalwart opponent of prohibition, of Sunday blue laws, and of compulsory education, the devoted champion of free trade, hard money, absence of governmental inflation, separation from banking from the state, and the absolute minimum government. It construed state power to be negligible and federal power to be virtually non-existent. On foreign policy, the Democratic Party, though less rigorously, tended to be the party of peace, anti-militarism, and anti-imperialism, but personal and economic libertarianism were both abandoned with the capture of the Democratic Party by the Bryan forces in 1896, and the foreign policy of non-intervention was then rudely abandoned by Woodrow Wilson 2 decades later. If you want further exposition of this point and the progressive era coming into being in the 1896 election, read Rothbard's Progressive Era. It's a fantastic book on the progressive era, and it expounds how that switch happened in 1896, thus bringing forward the progressive movement in America, as well as prohibition and all the rest of the bullshit that it brought. Continuing on, it was an intervention and a war that were to usher in a century of death and devastation, of wars and new despotisms, and also a century in all warring countries of the new corporatist statism, of a welfare warfare state run by an alliance of big government, big business, unions, and intellectuals that we have mentioned above. The last gasp, indeed, of the old laissez-faire liberalism in America was the doughty and aging libertarians who banded together to form the Anti-Imperialist League at the turn of the century to combat the American War against Spain and the subsequent imperialist American War to crush the Filipinos who were striving for national independence from both Spain and the United States. To current eyes, the idea of anti-imperialist who is not a Marxist may seem strange, but opposition to imperialism began with laissez-faire liberals such as Cobden and Bright in England and Eugene Richter in Prussia. In fact, the Anti-Imperialist League, headed by Boston industrialist and economist Edward Atkinson and including Sumner, consisted largely of laissez-faire radicals who had fought the good fight for the abolition of slavery and had then championed free trade, hard money, and minimal government. To them, their final battle was against the new American imperialism, was simply part and parcel of their lifelong battle against coercion, statism, and injustice, against big government in every area of life, both domestic and foreign. We have thus traced the rather grisly story of the decline and fall of classical liberalism after its rise and partial triumph in previous centuries. What, then, is the reason for the resurgence, the flowering of libertarian thought and activity in the last few years, particularly in the United States, that he's speaking of in 78, when this was published? How could these formidable forces and coalitions for statism have yielded even that much to a resurrected libertarian movement? Shouldn't the resumed march of statism in the late 19th and 20th centuries be a cause for gloom rather than usher in a reawakening of a seemingly moribund libertarianism? Why didn't libertarianism remain dead and buried? We have seen why libertarianism would naturally arise first and most fully in the United States, a land steeped in libertarian tradition. But we have not yet examined the question, why the renaissance of libertarianism at all within the last few years? What contemporary conditions have led to this surprising development? We must postpone answering this question until the end of the book, until we first examine what the libertarian creed is and how that creed can be applied to solve the leading problem areas in our society. Now, that's just the historical heritage and explanation of where libertarian credo comes from. And beings that this has been almost an hour and a half long, I'm going to continue to read it section by section. We'll see how it's reacted to, but main points is that it was seated in radical laissez-faire liberalism, and I will again, one more time, when people say that libertarianism was to the left of the radical leftists, he's speaking in historical context. Don't ever let anybody tell you that left libertarianism is to the left of Stalin or something, because that's a whole different thing. All statism is actually in the center, and they let you argue between left and right of the center, but the actual radical left or the radical right wing would be absolute liberty. It's like a circle. It all comes back full circle. So yeah, so to expound on that, we're gonna keep moving with For New Liberty, the Libertarian Manifesto, IMBC. I am your radical libertarian anarchist, and I will see you next time.